Recording now, and whoever is ready to jump in to take it away.
Okay, so in this case, I think you're just stuck with Kathi and I, so apologies at least for being stuck with me. Kathy's awesome. So as noted, today we're going to talk about Brightspace discussions and assignments. Now, we're just going to be talking about creating and managing these. We're not really going to get into grading. That's a workshop all on its own. So to start with, I am going to try to share my screen. Which is not cooperating. Oh, because it's over here. All right, let's see if this works. Okay, so everybody should see the homepage that we've all grown to know and love. To start with, I'm just going to go into one of our practice courses. Which again has decided to disappear. So the main thing to know to start out with is students will ideally be accessing their assignments and their discussions through content. You, however, will do most of your work through the course tools option. So we'll get back later into how you move the assignments and discussions from course tools into your regular content area. But for now, we're gonna go ahead to course tools and click on assignment. Now you can see I have a couple of assignments here already, and we're gonna go ahead and create a new assignment. Now, the first thing it's going to ask you to do, as always, is just create an assignment title. And then you have the option of deciding, do you want this to be an ungraded assignment or a graded assignment? Now, ungraded means that students turn it in and that is the end of it. You can't really do anything with an ungraded assignment other than see that students turned it in. However, if we click on here, we get the option to give it a number of points. Now, by default, it is going to go into the gradebook as a regular graded item. However, there are a few additional options. If you've already created a gradebook item, like some people set their gradebooks up in advance, you can just attach it to an existing one. Or you can tell it, I don't want this in the gradebook. Now, this gives you access to all of the commenting and grading tools, but it's not going to get added into the totals that you use for your gradebook. Now, with this first option, if I go ahead and edit or link to existing, this gives me some additional options. So if I had one already lined up, I could simply link it to an assignment. But this is where I can say, okay, you know what? I want this to go into a particular grading category, though you will have to have the category set up ahead of time. Or I can even change how I want this to be graded. So do I want this numeric? Do I want it in what's called a select box? If you've set that up, it allows you to choose from a pull down list. But maybe most importantly, I can say, okay, do I want my students seeing this as a percentage, or do I want them seeing it as a letter grade? So lots of options there. Usually what I do is I just leave it as 10 points in the grade book. That will put it into the grade book, and then I go sort out the rest of the stuff directly in the grade book later. Now you do have your due date. Simple as can be. You simply click on this and say, here's the time and date that I want this due. And that will automatically add this to the course schedule for students. So it'll give them a reminder and let them know, hey, this is due. It will also tag things as overdue if they go past that date, although it doesn't have any actual effect on their grade book. If you want to give them a late penalty, you need to go in and do that manually. So next we get to the instructions. This has your standard what you see is what you get interface. So you can type in here just like you would type into a normal Word document. The main thing that's a little neat here is that I do have access to insert stuff, which means I can insert YouTube videos or Panopto videos and say, here's a video, answer the following questions on it. Now, there is a flip side to that. Sheila, are you there?
Yes.
Can I use the GST course for a moment for an example of something?
Sure.
Okay, so what can happen is if you have a lot of assignments in a row, they start really chewing up your space. So what you may end up wanting to do is change it to something where you're just using attachments for your announcements. So actually, I think it's module 2 that had them all in it. So you see all of these things that say submit are assignments, and under normal circumstances, the full instructions for that assignment would show up and you'd just be scrolling forever. So what we did in this case is we just made the assignments into a PDF attachment. So they're still easily accessible, but they're not chewing up that endless amount of real estate. So thanks for letting me use you as a show and tell, Sheila.
Doug, how does that affect when they're in here, when you're grading them? Can you still preview the assignments if you don't have them?
Well, it's still a regular assignment. It's just instead of typing out all of the instructions, you type a short line of text and simply link it out to, in this case, we're using PDFs. So actually, excuse me, we used ads, insert stuff and just inserted a file that was on the computer, but it won't affect any of the previewing.
Okay, so when you're in there grading it, you can still preview the assignment.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it'll, so right now when you go in to grade an assignment, you have access to looking at the full instructions. This would be the same thing, except now there'd just be a link there that you click to go see what the instructions were.
Okay, thanks.
You also have some built-in options at the bottom, most notably record audio and record video. Use these with care. If you want to record a little audio tidbit on your instructions, that's fine, but keep it around 30 seconds. Otherwise, Kathi will come around telling you that you're using too much space. Now, the only other thing I'll say is with the name, think about the naming conventions, because as we saw in the assignment management, all of your assignments are just listed out. So it can be really handy to just put a little header on the front to say like M1, M2, M3, and then have the assignment name, just so for your usage, it's really easy for you to remember, oh yeah, that's where that assignment is. Now, the other thing that you'll see is we have this sidebar on the right. This is some of your more advanced options. So starting with availability and dates, these work exactly the same way as you're familiar with. You simply say students don't have access to this before this start date, and students don't have access to this after this end date. Now, the one slight difference is students will see the title of the assignment. So if they're looking through a module, they will see the title of the assignment. They simply will not be able to access it until these start and end, until these start dates. And similarly, they'll see it after the fact, but they won't be able to access it after the end dates. Release conditions and release conditions we really don't use much at the moment, but this would be a case where if you wanted students to have to take and score, say, a 90 on an intellectual integrity quiz before they could access the rest of module 1, that's the kind of thing you would use that for. Again, that's kind of its own session. And special access, this simply allows you with a specific user or a group to override whatever the stated start and end dates are. So if you have a student that is out for a funeral or something like that, that's what you would use to give them special access. Now, technically, you can use this to give somebody extra time, but as Carrie was showing yesterday, there's a way to do that through the roster where it just sets it for the entire course for a particular student. So that's going to be our recommendation if a student needs extra time. And actually, I just realized that's not applicable on assignments. Usually. Sorry, that's a quiz thing. Too many things going on in my head. So just know I would use manage special access to give somebody access outside of the start and end date that I have listed here. Submission and completion. The biggest one here is probably individual versus group assignment. Group assignments is as easy as clicking group assignment and selecting a group category that you have. Now you will need to set up the groups category beforehand, but that's not very hard to do. And essentially you just have a list of this group category has groups 1, 2, and 3. This group category has a different list of groups, and you just select the one that is appropriate. And this is how we handle group assignments. So if one person in the group submits their work, everybody will get that grade when you grade it. Now, this is a little different from limiting access. If you wanted to limit access to a specific assignment, that's when you would use that special access. Now, categories are a bit of an interesting one. The biggest thing you need to know is do not confuse this category with the grading categories, which are a completely different thing. This is purely an organizational thing, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Submission type is simply what sort of submission do you want? A file submission is a Word document, anything like that. A text submission is one that you type in. Now, if you are having the student do their work on a Google Drive, you need to set it for text submission so that they can copy and paste that link to Google Drive in. The other ones, paper submission and observed in person, are kind of special cases. Basically, you can think of these as manually entered columns. So you have to go into the grade book and manually type in the grade for that. How many submissions are allowed? I would always keep all submissions unless only one submission is allowed. I would never use this third option. I really don't think there's a lot of value to deleting previous submissions. the notification email does basically what it says it does. When a student submits work, an email will get sent out to whoever's emails are in there. And then evaluation and feedback. There's really only two things that you need to worry about here. The first is if I want to add a rubric, I would strongly recommend creating the rubric ahead of time using the rubric creating tool rather than trying to do it on the fly. So I would just go add existing and select the rubric that I want. And done and done. Now, the one thing to be aware of is that the ability of students to see the rubric is actually controlled at the rubric. So if I want the rubric to be visible for students, that's the default. So let's say I want it not to be hidden, or that I want it to be hidden from students until they get their feedback. I would need to go into the rubric tool and make that change there. The other thing is this is where you manage Turnitin. That is our plagiarism detection software. I'm not going to go into detail on that because we are still working out the final contract for that. So there may be some changes towards exactly what tools that we have. But once we wrap up that contract, there will be an announcement about that, and that is where you find the option to turn it on. So once you've done all of this, you've created your first assignment, and all you need to do is actually make it visible, which is this little thing down here. If this is not clicked, none of the rest matters. This overrides everything else. So just make sure it's visible and then save and close it. Now, access control is very important here. So always use either a start and end date or manually opening and closing dates. Students are supposed to access stuff through content, but there are a few back doors that allow them to get into stuff that you may not want them in if it's not manually closed. Now, I did manage categories briefly. Categories are basically a way for you to organize stuff. So right now I have no categories, but let's say I have one set of assignments that is my weekly practice assignments. And I want to separate those from my term paper. In that case, I can create a column and then I can drop any of these things right into that category. And now I'm slightly better organized. This has no effect on students. This is purely for your usage. And like I said, the biggest thing is just don't get these categories mixed up with the gradebook categories. If I need to edit an assignment after I've finished it, all I need to do is find the assignment and grab the little pull down menu and go to edit assignment. And I'm right back in that same screen. And as assignments come in, it will tell me, hey, you have new submissions you haven't read. Here's how many total submissions have been completed out of the class. Here's how many you've evaluated. Here's how many you've pushed out feedback on. And again, a lot of that we'll get more into when we talk about actual grading. So I'll get into how we move the assignment into content after we go through discussions because the options are exactly the same. But do you have any questions so far? Go ahead, Gwen.
I fear I have done this totally backwards. I created assignments not, I used course, I'm not sure if I used Course Builder to make my assignments or if I created the assignments in each week where I wanted them due. But I did think that they were linked to the gradebook. Do I need to delete them and do it backward, do it again?
No, as with all things in life, there's a bunch of roads to get to your final destination. This just happens to be the way that we've found to be the most logical, because if there's ever any issues with assignments, this is where we go to look at them. But they can be created in any number of different locations. And the main thing that you'd want to do is come to the assignment list and make sure that this little sort of ribbon like thing is next to it. That means that it is a graded assignment. And if that's there, then there's a pretty good chance that it is linked to the grade book. But yes, definitely don't delete them. If you have any concerns or you see any problems, though, just stick your head into office hours and we'll get you sorted out. Any other questions? Okay, so we'll continue on. The next thing we're looking at is discussions. So again, I'm just going to course tools and discussions. Now, kind of similar to assignments, discussions have an equivalent to categories, but they call them forums. So no matter what, you are going to have at least one forum. And again, the easiest way to look at this is just this is a category in which you can put multiple discussion topics. There are a few use cases for having separate or multiple forums, though. There's one instructor that has 4 or 5 discussions in each module, and students have the option to participate in like 2 out of 3. And in that case, it made a lot of sense to have, okay, here's a forum which includes all the discussions for module 1. Here's a forum that has all the discussions for module 2, etc. But in most cases, you'll only need a single forum, and just ignore the different restrictions and options because we'll set those at the individual topic level.
Doug?
Yeah.
I just want to use my metaphor too. So this is how I look at the forum. The forum is your file, you have your file cabinet, which is your whole course, right? And the forum is the drawer of your file cabinet. The topic is the folder that you are having that discussion in. So in Doug's case, you could have multiple drawers, right, for module 1 discussions, and then you would have each of your topics in there. So to me, that just kind of works because you have that topic, that folder, and that's where all the activity is going to go. It's going to be collected up in there. So I've been trying to get people to use as few of the discussion, few as the discussion forums as they need, only because it makes it easier when you're going through your class, your course, and looking at your discussions.
Yeah, it's far less cluttered. Like I said, there are some niche use cases, but in general, like Kathi said, fewer is better. Now, I will say that one neat thing you can do with the forum is always going to be the item in black. And if I grab that pull down, I have the option to view the forum statistics, which will show me literally everything that's happened in that forum and by students. So even if you're just using one, this is a good way to see what's the overarching usage of the discussions for the entire class by each student. However, what we really want to know is how to have a discussion. So now we're going to go new topic. Now, the first thing it's going to ask me is what forum do I want that topic in? And pretend this is my only my only forum, and I'm just putting all of my topics into a forum called discussions for the class. Now, the next thing, is this going to be an open topic where everybody can post, or is it going to be a group topic? Now, the nice thing with how this is set up is it will automatically give each group its own topic to work in. I don't know if you remember the system whose name shall no longer be spoken, but when you tried to do this in there, you had to set up an individual discussion for each group. In this case, it does it all automatically. Again, though, this works on the entire class, so you would have to, if you wanted only an individual group working in it, you would need to limit the people in that group set. And hopefully that made sense. Again, I give it a title. And like I said before, I like giving it some sort of code just to keep things straight for me. So I might call it Module 1, Discussion 2. And then whatever the actual topic is. And then I can write whatever instructions I want. Again, we're not going to get into what makes a good discussion, but there are a couple lines of thought there. Today, we're just going to ask our students, why did Jane leave Tarzan? And if you've gone to my other sessions over many years, you know that's one of my favorite questions. Now, generally speaking, we don't recommend using anonymous posts. They're ripe for students abusing them, and they don't offer a lot of academic virtue. But one that can be really handy is users must start a thread before they can read and reply to other threads. So that means the student will see the initial question, but they cannot see what anybody else did until they write their first post. Now, my view on this is really handy in lower division courses where you risk having students sort of cherry pick from what other students have done. Well, I'll read a few other posts and Frankenstein together something. But when you get into higher division posts, you can end up with a lot of people saying the same thing simply because they don't know what other people said. So turning this off gives them the option to read what other people have said and look for a niche that hasn't been addressed yet in their answer. But it's really up to you. And for what it is, it's a great tool that we use quite often. Now, unlike the assignments, the discussions are set up in a tabbed format. So once I've created the properties tab, I'd want to jump over to the restrictions tab. And by default, you'll notice that these are not hidden from users, unlike assignments. So if you want it hidden from users, you're going to want to check that box immediately. Otherwise, you have your standard availability dates for having a start date and having an end date, but it gives you a little bit more nuance in here in terms of, I can say, yes, they can see it beforehand, but they can't go into it. They can go into it and read the submissions, but they can't make any new submissions, or they flat out don't see this until the start date. Usually I leave the first option there because it works the same way as assignments. So students will see the link, know it's coming, but they won't be able to do anything. But afterwards, I like leaving it on visible with submission restriction, which means I can no longer post in it, but I can go and review the posts that I and others made. Now, one thing you will notice is that there is no due date on here, and I'll show you where to put the due date in later, but this is the one case in the entire system where you don't enter the due date in the item that you're creating. Next we go into assessment. This works very similar to how the other gradebook settings work. If I have a spot waiting, I can go ahead and assign it to a gradebook item. If I want to create a new gradebook item, I simply say I want to create a new gradebook item, and here I can create the name. Again, I like doing it in a way that makes it easy for me to find, so I'm just going to call it M1D2 discussion. I usually don't bother using the short name. They don't show up in very many places, and in a worst case, they can get confusing if you accidentally desync your names. Now, in this case, the category is the gradebook category. So in this case, I'm putting it into the discussion category. So this one is a category that matters. I don't bother with the descriptions or anything. Now you'll notice there is a max number of points here and here. I would strongly recommend that you make sure those match. Otherwise, it will take whatever score you give here and interpolate it into the score here. And if we have to fix it after the fact, it's really hard. Can exceed just means that I can give somebody 12 out of 10 points. Bonus means it does not count for the denominator of the gradebook, only the numerator, so it's basically extra credit. Or I can just say, yes, I want to grade this, but I don't want it to show up in the gradebook at all. And again, this is all stuff that we'll touch on again when we actually talk about grading. I will say don't touch the restrictions down here. This has nothing to do with whether or not the student can see the discussion. This has to do with when and if they can see their grade. So one unfortunate thing about Brightspace is they do like to use the same name in multiple different places for different things. So in the meantime, I've gonna pretend that I'm using this grade item and I'm giving it the points I want it to be out of. Same thing, I can add a rubric. Now there is also an option to grade by individual posts. We're just starting to experiment with this, but what I'm finding is that the only place you can go back and look at these is in the actual discussion, not in the grading view. So it can get a little confusing from your side when you're trying to add up the grades. I still like using the method where I have an individual line on the rubric for each individual post, and I can use that to enter in the grades, and then that gives me my total. But if you want to try using this, we'll work with you as we start getting a better handle on how to use this. Last but not least, we have this objectives tab. We actually are not using this at that time, so just pretend it does not exist. At this point, I can save and close. It's going to tell me I did something wrong because I didn't finish something on the individual posts. And now I'm back to my discussion creation screen. And again, once things get going, it will tell me how many initial posts have been made. That's what it means when it says threads. That's initial posts. And how many total posts have been made and how many have I not read. And from here, I can grab my pull down, and I actually always like turning on the grading, even if I'm not going to put it in the grade book because it gives me the access to this assess topic button. And there I can really quickly scroll through and see what each person has posted and what their score is. Sorry, it's not quite the view I meant to have. Sorry, so when I click on topic score, it would show me every post that they've made. And if I need to from here, I can follow that post to look at it in context. So that's sort of the management side of it. Or you can always just go into the discussion and read it the old-fashioned way and see everything that's in there just by clicking on it and running through what every single person has said. It'll tell you these are the initial posts, how many people have viewed it, how many people have replied to it, how many are unread in there. So this is for you in specific. This says, hey, there's posts in here that you haven't read. And then if I want to read more of it, I just click it and that'll give me the expanded view. So I'm actually going to skip questions because I'm running a little short on time. So I'm going to jump to the last part of this, but then I will have time for questions. So at this point, we've created course tools. We've created assignments and discussions in our course tools, but we want to bring them into our actual course. So I've gone into content, and I'm going to say that I want these in the icebreaker folder, which is in the module 1 demo folder. And all I have to do is click existing activity. And we'll start with discussions. I just click on discussion. It gives me a list of every discussion forum. But what I'm going to want to do is click on the item and go to the topic list. So again, this first list is my forums, but I don't want to add the forum. So I just click on the name and it will take me to the list of discussions, discussion topics. And now I can just click on the topic. And there it is right at the bottom. Why didn't it show up at the bottom?
Can you do that last
yep.
again, Doug? Because
Okay, so I'm working in a subfolder, so I can see the main folder up here. Here's the subfolder, and I'm just going to existing activities. I'm selecting discussions. I'm clicking on the forum name, and that gives me every topic that's in that forum. So then I can just click on the name of the topic, and it adds the discussion right to the bottom. And in this case, like I said, I was working in a subfolder, so it's adding it to the bottom of the subfolder. And assignments work exactly the same way. In this case, I'm going to work in the main folder, but I grab existing activities. I go down and find wherever assignments are hiding. Oh, how did I miss that? I find assignments, it's the first option. I click on that. It's going to give me a list of every assignment, and I just click on the assignment that I want, and it will add it at the very end. And that is it. So questions? Or if you have anything to add, Kathi.
I do not. Other than good job.
I always do a good job.
I actually have a question. Hi, this is Mamta.
Yep.
So the issue with me is anytime, and this is from Brightspace to Brightspace, actually, anytime I copy discussions from one semester to the other, there's several things within the discussion that do not get copied. Either it's a problem in the grade center, or it's a problem within the instruction level, within the forum level or topic level. What is the best way to copy discussions?
So are you copying the entire course, or are you just copying individual discussions?
The entire course.
Hmm.
And I see only the problem is with discussions and not with other assignments or quizzes and nothing else.
Yeah, that shouldn't be happening. And that may be an issue that we have to address in office hours, because
Okay.
it should be just a case that, you know, I want to copy stuff in from a different course. And then once I've selected the course I want, I just hit copy all components and it should grab everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, that's what I thought too.
yeah, so I
Um,
really don't know why it would be generating any sort of error. And like I said, at that point, that's something that we probably want to look into more in depth, which unfortunately means office hours. And of course, if you can't make regular office hours, just drop a line to help@oswego.edu and we'll schedule a time with you.
Sounds good. Yeah, no, thanks.
Other questions? Okay, so to wrap things up, as I already mentioned, if you ever need any help, the best way to get a hold of us is help@oswego.edu. That goes to a reflector that hits all of the IDs and Kathi. And it also puts it into our ticketing system, which really is our best way of making sure that nothing's falling through the cracks, because we get an enormous amount of email on a daily basis. Alternatively, we do have our office hours. Our office hours can always be found at oswego.edu DLE. And if this will load, and just go to Brightspace training. And if you scroll down a little bit, you'll see all of our office hours listed and the Zoom link for joining those. Just as a heads up, that is a protected Zoom link, so you do have to be signed into your SUNY Oswego Zoom account in order to get in. That way we don't get Zoom bombed. The reason this says May 17th for restarting our regular ones is because of Martin Luther King Day. But basically after that, we'll be going back to doing office hours 5 days a week. The other option that you have if you need help outside of regular business hours is the SUNY help desk, which if you just go to more and click help, you will see a link directly to the SUNY help desk right there. And you can either create a support ticket, or you can give them a call, or you can use their chat system. And they have longer hours than we do, 7 a.m. to 12 a.m. on Monday through Friday, and they have weekend hours. This is also where you want to send any student questions. These are the folks that are best equipped to handle students because they have BOMGAR, which lets them actually take over and operate a student computer.
Would you go back up so we can see the URL for that again?
It's just online.suny.edu.
Online.soon. Okay, thank you.
But again, the easiest way to get it, especially for your students, is just to be in Blackboard. And I wonder how long that's going to take me to get out of my system. In Brightspace, and go to the More tab and then click Help, and the link's right there. This also has links to a bunch of videos if you want to try some self-training, or otherwise, if it's 3 a.m. on a Saturday and for some reason you're working on it, you can see if you can find the answer for your question there.
So I just want to point out, because I learned this the hard way yesterday, Doug, is that faculty don't see the more, so it's underneath.
Oh.
help.
Okay, so you're saying for faculty, there's just a help tab there?
Yep,
Okay, and I presume it's the same for students?
correct. Students have the help. Mhm.
Okay.
And for right now, right now that the SUNY help is only listed in the course help, but I think if we go out here and look under the resources, it's not there. So I'm gonna stick that in there since I'm making some change. Well, no, that's where Brightspace resources are. Yeah, so inside your course. The Oswego is there.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, so all she's saying is that this is the institutional page. So what you're going to want to do is go into an actual course, and there should be a tab at the top that says help. And simply because I'm a system admin, mine looks slightly different. But just in general, we're going to be tweaking this particular list of menu commands based on feedback that we've gotten. So
It's coming out tomorrow if everything goes right in the Oswego today. The information on how it's changing.
All right, so that's really all I can think of, and I've basically hit 250 on the mark. So once again, we're always happy to see you at office hours. And with that, I think you can stop the recording.